Penelope Deutscher here from Northwestern University, Jana Sawicki from Williams College, and we're here talking with Lynne Huffer from Emory about her new book, Foucault's Strange EROS, out with Columbia University Press in 2020. And this is a work in which Lynne continues her interest in a particular kind of eros, and that is the eros of the archive, and her passion for what she describes and Foucault describes as its strange murmurings. Lynne's Mad for Foucault, the last work that we enjoyed from her, made a history of reason that we thought we knew a little stranger again. And she reminded that Foucault's history of madness was an archive also of perverse and queer murmurings, for unreason had also been unsexuality in various ways. So that was to make Foucault's history of madness a little stranger, allowing us to see how it also is a way of rethinking the foundations of queer theory. And then also eros was in that archive in another simpler sense, because Lynne performs in that work an interrogation, in all her work, an interrogation of how one's going to inhabit Foucault as an author or a reader, and the importance for Lynne of an infectious participation in a Foucauldian passion for the archive. So my first question for Lynne today is again about that passion for the archive and how it's changed in her work in the transition into this lovely new work, Foucault's Strange EROS.
Thanks, Penny. Yeah, so, Mad for Foucault actually emerged out of my own experience in an archive, which I think is important. I went to the Foucault archives in Normandy, and I had this experience of this encounter in an archive that had this quality that I'm calling eros. And I started seeing that more and more in Foucault's work as this kind of muted voice in Foucault. So this most recent book, Foucault's Strange EROS, is definitely drawing on that, but it's also going deeper into the question of what is eros, what do I mean by eros, what's an archive? So one of the things that I've pursued more deeply in the most recent book is this idea of an archive is not only a site where we go and we have these encounters and we're overcome by them or we're bored by them or whatever happens in that site as a concrete space, but it's also what Foucault describes in the archaeology of knowledge as a kind of operating system, epistemic conditions of possibility, right? The conditions of the possibility of intelligibility, of knowing, that we know so well in his work from the 60s. And so I think trying to think those things together is really important. And it's at the heart of the question of, is Foucault a philosopher, right? Is he somebody who thinks about things like epistemic conditions of possibility? Or is he a historian, right? Is he somebody who goes into archives and sifts through the remains of people's lives? I think he's both, but I also think he's a poet, right? He's a poet who is doing this poetic work in the sense of poiesis in the archive, making cuts in the archive, making line breaks, creating these systems, these ways of thinking, they're not systems, ways of thinking that introduce discontinuity into the activity of thought. And I think that's a really important aspect of what he's doing. And so I read Foucault and Foucault's Strange EROS through the lens of Sappho. I say he's more sapphic than Platonic in the way he thinks about eros and also in the form of his thinking. It's more poetic than philosophical.
This also brings us to a question from Jana, who had used a lovely expression. She'd seen you as rendering Foucault stranger than he might otherwise be understood, even by himself. Do you want to come in there, Jana?
Sure. I mean, in a preliminary way, I just want to say that Foucault's Strange EROS is a beautiful book, and I found it somewhat haunting as well. There's a kind of energy in it and a feeling tone to the book that is really moving, a little bit enigmatic, and it's quite captivating, really. So this is your third book in this trilogy. I'm familiar with all of them now. And the second one, I thought what's interesting, and the way in which I think Foucault is rendered even estranged to himself, in some ways has to do with the queer feminist angle that you're taking on him, the way you're turning him into almost a kind of queer feminist. And by coupling him in the second book, you do that with Irigaray in a very interesting way. Then in this one, you do it with Carson Sappho.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that the writing is really interesting and really not always clear to me, but that's only because maybe my poetic sensibilities have been deadened by all the time I've spent reading philosophy. I'm not sure about that. In any case, one question though that did arise for me, and what you said about the archives continues to make me think about this question. And maybe it's a little nitpicky, but I want to, and it's making me think, well, maybe I need to revisit the archaeology of knowledge. You refer to the archive of the outside, to the binding and unbinding character of it, to its untimeliness, and the claim that the historical a priori conditions the archive in some sense. And these same terms, untimely, binding, unbinding, also refer to the activity of EROS. So it seems to me that EROS is in some sense archival. Now, I've thought of the historical a priori as the conditions of possibility of what can be said, what's visible, who can speak, what are the concepts that are available in a particular time. So it is really what the conditions of intelligibility are, what could speak, who could speak, how they speak, with authority. And on this account, the outside would be what cannot be thought or seen, or what can't be spoken or felt even. And that is a kind of set of rules. The historical rules are the historical a priori. The outside is in some sense what's available that has not been taken up in the historical a priori. So it speaks to discontinuity between what has been taken and then what confers the limits on our present way of thinking, but also what's outside those limits is archival material. It's also what's outside those limits are things in history we haven't been able to think about, right? Or have no force, have no impact, so to speak, on the present. I'm totally with you on the sense that he recognizes that any attempt to synthesize history, to turn it into something systematic or whole, is going to fail, and that what he does is he fractures it. And I'm totally with you there. So I guess on my reading, the historical a priori is more of a binding force, whereas the archive could be both. And so insofar as it's drawn from the archive in some sense, or it's documented in the archive, he finds it in the archive, right? Or postulates that it might be there. There's what's outside of that is the material that's not part of it. And that would be the limit. That would be, you'd find the edges, the limit in the historical a priori, and the way of fracturing it in the archive. That's the way I've thought about it. And I just want to know if that's a friendly way of looking at it, or if you would want to push back, because I may just need to go back to the archaeology for this.
Yeah.
I found the relationship between the binding and the unbinding that Jana was picking up on, very helpful. So the historical a priori, as she's putting it, would have like a binding function, and then it seems as if the way that Lynne is wanting to think of the archive has a kind of unbinding capacity, which
Yes.
of course, becomes politically important from the purposes of the potential for transformation. But I know you would want to press down on that as well, Jana. So
Yeah.
What about
That's such a great question. And all of this actually came out of a really interesting seminar workshop that Amy Allen organized on the historical a priori in Husserl and in Foucault. So we had a bunch of Husserl scholars and a bunch of Foucault scholars, and he borrows the term from Husserl, but I think the way he uses it is very different. So on the one hand, you have this term a priori, which is a kind of, timeless template of some sort of order, right? But historical introduces this idea of some sort of contingency or change. And so there's something really paradoxical about the term. In the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault says it's startling. That's the word he uses. It's a startling term. As a thinker of paradox, I think he loves that kind of, again, that rift, that contradiction in the term itself. So I really take that seriously, and I read it, as I said, as both binding and unbinding. and I think it works in conjunction with the archive as something that is both binding and unbinding. So we live within these epistemic limits, within this particular frame, as you say, of, you know, these conditions of possibility for speaking, for knowing, for feeling. But at the same time, because time itself is this force of dissolution, right, of unbinding, right, we are living within that dissolving sense, right? So the present itself is not a site of stability. So if today we're living in a particular historical a priori, that historical a priori is already unstable, right? It's already unstable. And I think the archive reveals that. At the same time, the archive is also a binding site. It's a site of violence. It's a site that pins people down in documents, right? In asylum registers and police reports. It's also, you know, so it's part of what Foucault would call this carceral network, right? A carceral system that is both discursive and non-discursive, that pins people down. And what he says in Discipline and Punish, I think is really important, which is that it has no outside. The carceral network has no outside. So we live in this present, this biopolitical carceral present that has no outside. And that's the conundrum that this book explores, is how can you have this thought of the outside within a carceral network that has no outside? Does that make sense? And so that's why I go back to this 1966 Blanchot essay, The Thought of the Outside, or The Thought from the Outside, La Pensée du Dehors, where he's reading Blanchot and he's reading it through the lens of what he calls the being of modern literature, which is a literature that has no foundation except the I speak. And he uses this I speak of modern literature to erode the sort of uninterrogated interiority of the Cartesian thinking subject, of the I think. I feel like that's what he's doing philosophically, and that to me is why that literary I speak is so important, and why, again, I'm reading him as a poet. So I feel like the outside that we see in his essay on Blanchot is very different than what we would call the outside of an archive or the outside of a carceral system. The archive is part of that carceral system. And so it's about the act of I speak in its relation to the I think, that some sort of unbinding is going to happen.
Thinking about how that becomes important to contemporary life, there's a remark that you make about the grand confinement, which is often associated with forms of power that have become lessened in importance today. And you remark that the grand confinement is a form of power that's become a quasi-permanent condition of contemporary American life. And I hope that you might go back to that. And my question there was, there's a lot of ways in which one could offer critical intervention into the strength of confinement in contemporary life. And I wanted to ask you why, for you, the archival event is so important to the kinds of critique that we can offer of the grand confinement of today.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I think that phrase that you just brought up about the archival event is in the chapter that I wrote about Foucault's anti-prison activism.
That's right.
With the GIP, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons. And this was in the early 70s. And one of the things he says in one of his interviews from that period is that there's, he's referring back to the 17th century Great Confinement that he talks about in History of Madness, where 1% of the Parisian population was locked up, never to be seen or heard from again. He calls that the Great Confinement, and he aligns that with the rise of what he calls the Cartesian ratio, which is the confinement of reason within the interiority of the thinking subject. So he says, today, in the early 70s, we see the return of a new Great Confinement. That's what he says. It's really interesting. Like, why does he say that? And what I think is he's referring to the massifying pole of biopower, right? Which is the massification of populations, right? The massification of life as populations, that's, again, both discursive and non-discursive through the development of these statistical rationalities that create normal curves, that predict risk and so forth, but that also lock people up. Again, it's discursive and non-discursive, and it's a massifying, confining force. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about this carceral network, right, that includes everything within it. So what does that have to do with this archival event? I mean, the way I read the Jeep today, right, in the 21st century, this is this phenomenon that happened in the early 70s. Most people say it was a failure. You know, it lasted for about a year. What the argument that I make in that chapter is that the Jeep still exists as an archive, right? It exists as an archive that can emerge again when we go into that archive in the present. And we make those poetic cuts into the archive. We produce these new archival events that produce discontinuities within the continuity of this new great confinement, right? Of this new carceral network that is statistical and that works on this massifying pole of biopower, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And they're poem lives. Some of them, yes.
Exactly. And they emerge as these poem lives, right? Which are these fragments, right? Which goes back to the Sapphic. They're these fragments. And I think that they're of a piece with, you know, the epistemic breaks that he talks about in the order of things, the line breaks of the poet. These are breaks in this carceral rationality, in this carceral order, which is our present, that, quote, has no outside. So it's almost like the line break of the poet produces within that a thought of the outside. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. This has been a taster for a conversation that we'll continue to have over the months to come, and we'll re-meet again at the SPEP conference next year. And we look forward to that very much. Thank you for sharing this great new book with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.